Frederic. Okay, so thank you all for joining us today. We're very excited that you have responded to our call, and we are all together here in this workshop to discuss about citizen science and biodiversity. We are really looking forward to our discussions, and we are very confident that we will have really fruitful and lively discussions that will drive forward our work here and your work as well, the ongoing efforts on biodiversity. Today we have a lot of you, 55 really participants registered who will be joining. There is a pool of experts, and as you can see here in the pie in this chart, they are from diverse backgrounds and from diverse institutions. Most of them are involved in national or international institutions, EU institutions, but also initiatives that deal with monitoring and citizen science at regional, national, or international level. There are many Biodiversa partners already. So with this blend of background and people, we're really looking forward to our discussions. Exactly, there are people who are involved not only in initiatives that deal with citizen science and monitoring in biodiversity, but in different also factors. So we are very confident that you will bring, and we will discuss into today's seminar workshop, all this experience that you have. We have already done a preparation work. We have identified some bottlenecks and challenges that we really wish to take further, discuss with you. So I will give the floor to Frederic to present you briefly the scope and the aims of this seminar, as well as the follow-up of the seminar, and of course the agenda. We have a quite big number of participants, which will allow us to split into 2 sessions, as you already know, and the first session will be then further split into 2 subsections, but we are confident that we will be in parts together and in parts separately, but let's say all the conclusions will be drawn together, and we will also listen to very interesting keynote speeches. Please, Frederic, I give you the floor. Thank you, and welcome, and thank you for participating.
Thank you very much, Anna. I realize we didn't really introduce ourselves, Anna, so please allow me to. Anna Rosenberg is our Biodiversa representative from the Greek partner in Biodiversa, GSRI, and she is leading especially here the task related to citizen science in our monitoring work. On our biodiversity monitoring work. And myself, I'm Frederic Lemaitre. I'm the Science Society Science Policy Officer for Biodiversa, and I'm more involved in the capacity building aspect and engagement and collaboration with citizen science initiatives in Biodiversa. I'm supported in doing so directly by Julia Beth, who you will have the occasion to see speak a bit later on, and Anna on her side is directly supported by Cécile Mandon, who is also very active behind the scenes of this workshop, and with who I'm sure you've had a chance to exchange already. So to give you a brief overview of the workshop agenda, as introduced by Anna, we will first have a presentation by Hilde Egermont, who is the Biodiversa chair and coordinator of the Belgian Science Policy Office, about Biodiversa Plus, what we are and what we've done so far on citizen science. And then we've invited two experts directly involved in citizen science to give some keynotes around the topics we're discussing today. And then you can see we have a short break, and after that we'll be moving into the collaborative part of this workshop, where we have planned some discussions in a subgroup to think about these different the way Biodiversa Plus can work around this topic of citizen science, and what added value it can have and in alleviating barriers to citizen science and promoting long-term engagement of citizens in science. And of course, then we'll have a plenary wrap-up so that you can hear a bit what were the main ideas raised in the other group. Okay, in terms of overall objectives for this workshop, next slide, please. We have a first one, which is about really focused on the monitoring aspects of in relation to citizen science, and it's so how can we better support and integrate citizen science approaches in biodiversity monitoring? You'll see in the presentation from Hilde that this is about building European governance of biodiversity monitoring and citizen science aspects in there. So that's really the opportunity we have here, and that you have here to voice your ideas around this question. And then we have the two other objectives. So one more about setting up collaborations with citizen science initiatives and co-developing activities around education and citizen science, and serving shared objectives with third-party initiatives to the partnership. And also we have a stream of work around developing capacities, especially of researchers, to engage and use in a positive way citizen science. And so we would like to work also around identifying the needs for capacity building on citizen science from a research perspective. And with this short introduction of our overall objectives, I will hand over to Hilde Egermont. As I said, Hilde is the chair of Biodiversa Plus and the coordinator of the Belgian Science Policy platform, in addition to a number of other engagements. Please go ahead, Hilde.
Thanks so much, Frederic. So what I will try to do is, in a nutshell, explain you a bit what Biodiversa Plus is about, and also how these activities fit in, and also how it builds on some previous work that we have done. Next slide, please. So Biodiversa Plus, the plus is basically reflecting the fact that we are the successor of Biodiversa, which was a network of mainly research programmers and funders that were supporting research on biodiversity on an annual basis. We were launching annual calls. But then over the years, so the network was existing since 2008, but over the years, we have also increasingly invested in co-production of knowledge, and also bringing the science to society and to policy, and also the internationalization became more and more important. And then in 2021, together with the European Commission, so both with DG Environment and DG Research, we developed the European co-funded Biodiversity Partnership, which is now Biodiversa Plus. So we are working since October 2021, and it's a program that will run over at least the next 7 years. The main difference with the previous or old Biodiversa is that we now have both the ministries of research, the funding agencies, and the foundations on board, but also the ministries of environment and environmental protection agencies. So we are in a better capacity now to bridge between science and policy, and also to connect it with biodiversity monitoring. and also to embark on new streams of work, and especially this biodiversity monitoring component is quite new to our work. So in terms of type of membership, that has been expanded, but also the number of partners have increased substantially. We are now over 70, and we hope that over the next few weeks, months, we will be over 80, so that we have a very good coverage across Europe, but also indeed these two types of policy actors. Also in terms of the whole budget amplitude of the program, that has also been significantly scaled up. As I mentioned, it's co-funded by the European Commission. So they are co-funding our program with 165 million euros over 7 years. And the other budget is supplied by the partners of Biodiversa Plus. So it's really a joint effort coming together. Then in terms of the portfolio of activities of Biodiversa, again, we have an upscaling compared to the past. The funding of research is still at the heart of what Biodiversa Plus is doing, so it's still central stage. So every year we launch a call for research proposals, quite a substantial call, so each time around 40 million euros. So we are then each year in a position to fund around 35 to 40 pan-European projects. So these are medium-sized projects running over 3 years. But then we also do many activities to further valorize the outcomes from these projects, and we also help to ensure that there's co-production of the knowledge. A second stream of work is the work that we do on biodiversity monitoring, and the overarching objective here is to set up a European observation network. I'll come back to that later. Then there's a stream of work focusing specifically on supporting the knowledge base for the development and the deployment of nature-based solutions. And this also includes engagement with the private sector. Then there's a fourth stream of work that is mainly focusing on science-based policy support. So that really means that our members, both research policy actors and environmental policy actors, shape the program together. So there's a co-design of all the work that we do, so that it's also of relevance for both, but also that we have many activities to indeed bring the science to the policy-making level, both private and public. And then there's also the work that we do more at the global level. And that, of course, relates to the work that we can do as Biodiversa Plus in the context of the Kunming-Montreal Global Biodiversity Framework. We also play a very specific role in the IPBES, the Intergovernmental Platform for Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services, because we are hosting also part of the Secretariat that is responsible for knowledge generation. So we really also analyze the knowledge gaps in existing IPBES assessments and bring it back to the research programmers and funders so that they can help to mobilize research that can close the gaps. And then there's also work that we do, for example, in relation with global research infrastructures like GBIF and others. So that's a bit the 5 main streams of work that we try to cover. And then we also have activities which are much more transversal. And this also includes capacity building activities, including also the work that we will discuss today. So also including capacity for building activities for the scientific community to better engage with citizens and build in a citizen science component in their projects, but also other types of capacity building activities, also in relation to science policy interfacing work. And also work on open science, open data is a central stage, and also other stakeholder engagement activities and communication. So just to say, it's quite encompassing, but all these activities are not working in isolation. It's really a very holistic approach that we try to apply across the portfolio of work. Next slide, please. So yeah, this is just to show where the things that we're currently discussing. It's partly within the work stream of the biodiversity monitoring, but then also linked up to the more transversal activities that we have in Biodiversa Plus. Next slide, please. So this is just another way of showing that all the activities that we have, which are shown on the left side, clearly align with the European Biodiversity Strategy 2030, and of course also with the new Global Biodiversity Framework. So our objectives are closely aligned. And we are also part of the European Biodiversity Strategy 2030, where we are explicitly mentioned to make the bridge between science, policy, and practice. Next slide, please. So zooming in a little bit on the work that we do on biodiversity monitoring, because that's also part of the things that we will discuss today. So as I mentioned, the overarching objective is to set up this European observation network, like a network of harmonized monitoring schemes across Europe, but clearly building on existing national and subnational biodiversity monitoring schemes. So we do not want to reinvent the wheel, but really provide capacity to reinforce these schemes, to set up new schemes, and also provide capacity for harmonization. I will show you in one of the next slides that this is something that we don't do alone. Clearly, we do it in collaboration with other initiatives. You can first go back to the previous slide. I will first see a bit of how the different activities relate, and then indeed I can elaborate on how we collaborate with other initiatives to do this. So if we say harmonization of biodiversity monitoring schemes, it's obviously very encompassing. First of all, because we realize that we cannot do that, at least for now, for all taxa, for all levels of biodiversity. So we really need to set some priorities. So that's something that we do together with the partners. We set priorities to start from. These could include, for example, protected areas, soil biodiversity, invasive alien species, and some other biodiversity facets. And then starting from these priorities, we really focus on harmonization of protocols, methods, databases, also trying to improve data interoperability together with research infrastructures and with other data infrastructures. There's also a very specific focus on supporting the development of new methods and technologies and approaches for biodiversity monitoring, and also ensure better uptake of these approaches. And that's also what we will discuss partly today, because citizen science is also perceived as one of these methods. And then it goes all the way down to better use of monitoring data, not only by the research community, but also by policy, and again, both by private and by public policymakers. So with Biodiversa Plus, we try to work along these different building blocks, but the overarching objective is really to set up this European observation network. Next slide, please. And as I mentioned, it's not something that we do alone. So Biodiversa Plus, we have these ministries of environment, these environmental protection agencies. So these are clearly the members that are steering and funding the biodiversity monitoring schemes in their countries. But we work hand in hand with Europabon, who is really the network of biodiversity monitoring initiatives, those that are doing the work also in the field. So we are very complementary. And then we also do this work together with, for example, the European Environment Agency that has this clear mandate also for the reporting. We also do it together with the GRC and with, as I mentioned, also with data and research infrastructure. So I just want to say that this big overarching objective is also a collective effort, and each of these initiatives plays their role. The overarching objective is also further made more concrete in the terms of that there's some thinking to also set up a European Biodiversity Monitoring Coordination Center. But of course, we don't want this to be very top-down. We see the need for some coordination at the European level and some guidance that will come from a central point. But at the same time, we do want to design something that actually makes sense in the context of the country's realities, and also something that is co-designed with those that are steering the monitoring schemes, funding the monitoring schemes, implementing these schemes, and so really engaging with the broader base. So again, that happens through the different initiatives. And also with Biodiversa Plus, we try to operationalize solutions and also indicators that are being designed by Europabon, which is more like the technical arm of Biodiversa Plus. And then we try to bring it back indeed at the operational level in the countries. And we have currently also several what we call biodiversity monitoring pilots running to actually test some of this harmonization in the countries in different contexts. So this is just a bit in a nutshell to show it's a collective effort. But with Biodiversa, we do play a specific role, and especially these citizen science activities and initiatives, this is something where we think we can also try to reinforce what is already existing, but maybe also bring something addition to the landscape, especially in relation to the scientific community. This is just a slide to also recognize the complexity of the landscape we are working in. And as I mentioned, the last thing we want to do is to kind of add complexity or to further or to duplicate what others are doing. So with the many initiatives that are there and that play their role, we try to build bridges, set up key collaborations so that there's an added value for both, and just making sure that we can close some of the gaps. So just to say, everything is done in coordination with other initiatives, and also not only with other initiatives, but also with other partnerships. We were the very first partnership that started of the many, I think it's more than 40 partnerships that will be established over the next few years. So we were the first one, but now we also have a few others that are up and running, including, for example, the Water for All partnership, the Driving Urban Transitions partnership, and several others. So you probably have heard about these other partnerships. So again, we try to do the work in collaboration with these partnerships, recognizing that biodiversity is a transversal issue. Next slide, please. So that was just like Biodiversa Plus in a nutshell. The work specifically in relation to citizen science is not entirely new to us. We have something to build from the previous Biodiversa. Most notably, we had developed what we call a citizen science toolkit. It was really a toolkit to be used by our scientific community, building on best practices from some of the projects that we have funded. So we have surveyed the work that we have done in the past and with these projects. And so that allowed us to kind of showcase a few what are good practices, good methods, tools, examples, and also make some recommendations of how projects could build in a citizen science component in their projects and how they could also scale that up. So that's what is part of the Citizen Science Toolkit. In this toolkit, you will also find other resources like a directory of tools, methods, also entry points to some useful publications. So it's quite encompassing, but it's also building on existing resources. So again, it's not something entirely new. It's just a place where we have tried to bring everything together for the scientists that are replying to our calls, make sure that they find their way, and also to give them some very concrete showcases of how they could do it based on some previous good practice. Next slide, please. So while we were developing this toolkit that is currently also under development to be updated, but I guess Frédéric will also come back to that. So there were already a few challenges that were identified. So here you just see a list. I'm sure that some of these challenges will come back during the breakout groups, and that many of these are not new to the initiatives that are joining this workshop today. So just to highlight a few, so very often it seems quite difficult to find volunteers or even to sustain the volunteers on the long term. So we do need some very sustainable funding to support them. At the same time, the citizen science is not always properly acknowledged. It's often not always easy to validate the data that come from citizen science projects. Sometimes the data are of poor quality, and so there might be some bias in what is being collected by citizens, but still there should be ways to then improve these databases. Often the citizen science landscape is still viewed as being too fragmented. So even for our scientific community, it's quite difficult to navigate. So that's maybe also something that we can try to improve together. The funders that we have within Biodiversa Plus, they may have very different expectations of what they expect from projects in terms of citizen science. So it's also maybe our duty to bring these expectations in balance with what the scientists can actually offer and what citizens can offer. And then also, yeah, there may be several other things also in relation to data privacy and data safety. So many things were already picked up or highlighted in this citizen science toolkit, but I'm sure that you have lots of things to say about all of these things, and that for sure you also have other challenges that you can bring to the table where maybe Biodiversa Plus can be of added value to overcome. Next slide, please. So that was a bit the work that we've done in Biodiversa, and as I mentioned, this toolkit will be updated also with input that comes from this workshop. But then also in Biodiversa Plus, as I mentioned, we are only up and running since end of 2021, but still we've done a bit of work to pave the way to some citizen science activities that we could embark on. One of the things that we've done is we've produced a report on the knowledge gaps and research needs in relation to biodiversity monitoring. So that was the result from also a workshop that was held last year. And we had very specific focus for identifying these knowledge gaps and research needs. We had 3 entry points. One was the testing and the application of new tools, technologies, and approaches for biodiversity monitoring. Then there was indeed this focus on citizen science engagement, citizens and citizen science in biodiversity monitoring activities. And then also there was a specific focus on use of biodiversity monitoring data by research and innovation. And this has actually also this workshop was then also used to develop the second call of Biodiversa that was launched in October 2022. That's the call that we have currently running and specifically focusing on biodiversity monitoring. So now we have a call running of 40 million euros that will advance also the knowledge on this topic. And so these workshops are very useful for us to then implement very concrete activities. Next slide, please. So again, one of the challenges that came up in that work was that indeed data are not always standardized, which is preventing us also from scaling up citizen science data. Also that the methods for citizen science could possibly be improved also to have more standardized data. Again, the issue of data quality and possible bias came up. And also the fact that we need to work on a culture that is recognizing the value of citizen science in scientific work and in scientific projects. And then also the lack of ethical and legal guidelines for citizen science. So these are just a few things that popped up in that work. And I think then that's my next slide. So the workshop also pointed to possible ways forward for engaging citizens in biodiversity monitoring, and we are still reflecting on how we could move that forward with Biodiversa Plus. So one of the things that was mentioned was that we could support the involvement of more citizens with broader profiles, also involve practitioners, and then also, when possible, match people's motivations and data needs, so to streamline basically. Also, there could be there seemed to be a need for an online platform that could reinforce data quality and also data management and open access. Of course, this is something that might already be happening in many other initiatives, so maybe it's more the question of connecting all these different initiatives and making sure that that people can navigate this very complex landscape. But on the other hand, there may also be some very specific needs for data interoperability that we can also push for as Biodiversa Plus. And also creating the sense of a community that works towards the same goals and aims. Also work to really showcase the added value of citizen science for biodiversity monitoring, because that's not always sufficiently highlighted. This is often running just in the back, but citizens, they constitute a major component of providing us with the data that we need also in terms of the ultimate reporting towards the targets. So this should not be forgotten, and their contribution should be further highlighted and demonstrated. Also, there's quite a bit of work that still needs to be done in terms of promoting some novel technologies for biodiversity monitoring amongst citizens, and that could include artificial intelligence, but also we know that there's some applications even on mobile phones and very useful applications that should be further promoted. So I will leave it here, I think, unless there's a next slide. No. Maybe we can now just open the floor for some questions if you have before we move to the next speakers. So feel free to raise your hand or put the question in the chat. Don't see any immediate questions.
You have a question from
yeah.
David Roy?
Yeah, David.
Hi, thanks. That was really interesting. I was wondering if you could say a bit more about, you mentioned that Biodiversa Plus, the network, may be expanding. Can you give any indication of, is that more countries in Europe or outside of Europe?
There are a few that have really expressed interest, and they are now actually part because the General Assembly approved. So these include, for example, Georgia. We are also exploring with Switzerland, the UK, Malta, Cyprus. We have some additional partners on the radar. So it means not only having additional partners from countries that we already have on board, but also from new countries. And this also includes, we also had this morning a discussion with Ireland, and we have Scotland on the radar. So we do hope we have some clear, we see some very positive signs that we will be able to scale up even in countries that used to be part of Biodiversa but then dropped out, but we hope to get them back. But also partners that we never engaged with. So there seems to be like a momentum to scale up across Europe, broadly speaking.
It's great to hear. Thank you.
Any other questions?
Okay, I think we have one more question. Timo Pialati. I'm sorry for pronunciation of the name, probably. I'm sorry.
much more exotic than mine.
Yes, thanks. Well, no problem. Finnish names are sometimes exotic. I was just wondering if you have already decided or find out what is the best technical platforms for integrating the different inputs from the citizen science from different platforms and applications. Thanks.
So far, not yet. So as I mentioned, we actually had several workshops with different data infrastructures. But actually next week we will sit together with a few of these, and also including with the European Environment Agency and with some research infrastructures to really also, and data infrastructures to think about how this plays out in practice. So we've done some initial work in the first year, but now we bring it down really to what does it mean at a very pragmatic implementation level. So I would say it's in the making. But yeah, I'm not yet in a position to give you very concrete answers, but it's worked on at a very practical level currently.
I'll follow up on that one. If there's going to be some kind of a procurement process for these kind of things, or something kind of tendering or call for proposals or something like that on those things.
So it's maybe early days to say that. I think what we will first do is to kind of try to nail down what needs to be done, and then we'll check how this should be done. So this might be an option that some things, of course, I mean, we are as Biodiversa Plus, we have very a specific type of membership, so we cannot do everything ourselves, and that's also not the purpose. So sometimes we work through third parties, or sometimes we indeed launch call for tenders to implement some of the work that we do. So but it's maybe a bit early days to say whether we will do this specifically for this purpose, but it's definitely an option to be considered.
Thank you.
Any other questions? All right, then I'll hand over to Frederik again.
Thank you very much, Hilde, and I won't take too much time now. It's just to introduce our next speaker, which is the first of two interventions for setting a bit the scene of this workshop. So this would be Mrs. Carrie Seltzer from iNaturalist, who will talk to us first about challenges related to biodiversity and citizen science. Carrie is a stakeholder engagement strategist for iNaturalist. As such, she's involved in the coordination of the iNaturalist International Network and more generally stakeholder relationships in there. And so before joining iNaturalist 5 years ago, she worked on open data policy with the Belmont Forum, which is an international consortium of programmers and funders similar to Biodiversa. And she is based in Washington, DC, and there she is active also, of course, in local initiatives to increase awareness and participation in citizen science in the region. Carrie, I see you on the screen, and I take this opportunity to hand over to you.
Thanks very much, Frederic. So should I start sharing my screen?
I think we would have your slides integrated ready, and you can just say next slide when you want us to move forward.
Okay, great. Well, then next slide, please.
Here we go.
Great. Thank you, everyone. Thank you for the invitation. Thanks for showing up, and apologies for any background noise you might hear this morning for me. I read through the, in reading about the workshop and reading the sort of charge of this group, I'm excited to I'm excited to take this opportunity to think about what the challenges that we struggle with most for iNaturalist, and think also about the aspects of those that may be most transferable to other citizen science programs, and especially around biodiversity, which is just so so difficult in so many ways, yet so important. Next slide. We know that biodiversity faces many threats, and in order to address those threats, we tend to think about these two specific challenges a lot in the context of iNaturalist. One is that we need a lot more people involved and paying attention to biodiversity, so that, because ultimately if things are going to happen, it's going to happen because of people. The other piece of this is data, and I'm using data as a shorthand for data, information, knowledge, and wisdom, that whole flow. But at iNaturalist, we've been especially focused on the data piece and are really interested in that whole stack. But people and data are two themes that we come back to again and again in terms of how we are going to move the needle to address threats to biodiversity. Next slide. So I wanted to give just a high-level overview of what iNaturalist is and how it works before we get into the specific bottlenecks that I want to talk about. iNaturalist exists to connect people to nature through technology by sharing their encounters with biodiversity and crowdsourcing species identifications, so that we can accumulate data and draw insights from that to advance our protection of biodiversity. Next slide. Essentially what the key unit of participation and sharing on iNaturalist is an occurrence record, or an observation as we mostly call it. And this contains essential information about who you are, because you can't contribute sort of under an anonymous account. I mean, you can have a pseudonymous account, but not a completely anonymous account. There needs to be an account. This essential data about where and when it was preferably with some evidence. Overwhelmingly, observations on iNaturalist have photographic evidence associated with them, but there are a small minority of observations that have sounds or don't have any media associated. And this question of what you saw is something that not only can the original observer help with that question, but we really opened it up to the community. I'll come back to that in a minute. But these are the key elements of an iNaturalist observation. Next slide. And because iNaturalist, I mean, I think really biodiversity has an advantage compared to some other areas of citizen science, because there has been so much work on standardization of how occurrence records are shared, thanks to the Darwin core infrastructure and GBIF also. So iNaturalist data can be shared beyond iNaturalist through exporting it, and also via the Darwin core archives that we automatically prepare and share with data partners, especially including GBIF. Next. So in this way, we have worked to make data from iNaturalist findable, accessible, interoperable, and reusable so that it's not trapped. Our goal is to make it available. Next. It is always essential to acknowledge that the only reason iNaturalist works is because of the vast number of people who are involved, some of them deeply so. So thank you to the iNaturalist community. I know that at least a few of you out there are members and active participants. So thank you for your role in that. iNaturalist is not magic, it's people. So thanks. Next. So in thinking in this question of bottlenecks, like what are the things that we find we've had to overcome through iNaturalist, and what are the things that we are currently struggling with? That's what I'm going to talk about. The first of those bottlenecks that I'll address is expertise. If you think about what people can do, what any given individual person can do, many more people can make an observation. Everyone encounters biodiversity somewhere at some point. And with smartphones, it's really easy to snap a picture, and we've tried to make it easy on iNaturalist to share those observations. But the knowledge of how to identify what you're seeing is far more specialized information. So what we have done in iNaturalist, which is different than a lot of other programs, we have separated the observation process and the identification process so they don't have to happen by the same person. In, for example, some checklist model programs, it requires a much higher level of expertise in order, for example, to record a butterfly checklist, because you've got to have that knowledge of the individual recording the checklist to know that they saw what they saw. But in iNaturalist, because it's tied to evidence, you can submit an observation of a moss that you took a photo of, and you have no idea what kind of moss it is. But if your photos are good enough and clear enough, and if the expertise is well developed enough, someone else can help you with that. Next. So in this example, the original observer actually didn't add an observation and identification at all. Someone else in the community came along and said, I don't know what kind of moss it is, but I can say that it's a moss. And then someone else came along and identified the moss species based on the available evidence. Next. Another key aspect to unlocking expertise that iNaturalist has leveraged is the global nature of the platform. This is a snapshot from about a year ago of 1 hour of activity on iNaturalist. And what's happening is it's connecting the location of the more than 5,000 new observations that were added in that hour to the location of the person who added an identification to that observation. So you can see there's massive exchange of knowledge happening from different parts of the world. And during this time, you can see there were about more than twice as many identifications added as observations during that period of time. Next. Another way that we've tried to address the potential expertise bottleneck is through machine learning. We've used the tens of millions of photos and identifications in iNaturalist to train a computer vision model to suggest identifications based on visual similarity. And we're now in the process of trying to do a more sophisticated job of also incorporating geographic context into the identifications that are selected or that are offered, as well as giving suggestions at the appropriate taxonomic precision, because we don't want to over recommend species level identification, for example, if genus or even family level identification is more appropriate. So we are at the point now where we're updating this model every month, and this is a really active area of development for us. We did release it originally in 2017, but we know that there's still a lot that we can do to improve this experience. This is just an example of what it looks like in the iOS app. I took this photo of a violet, and those are the recommendations that it made. You were right though. Next slide, thank you. But one of the things that we find on iNaturalist is that we would really love to see more support and more people who are playing this really important role of bridging museum and field characters. For example, for these lesser known taxa that may not have field guides out there, usually don't, or only have field guides in certain parts of the world, there's a really important role for these people to play. Next slide. And this can happen in a lot of different ways, but and this is an area where we haven't built really good tools for this on iNaturalist, and so people are just sort of coming up with lots of different approaches to this. But I just wanted to show one example of what I mean and what might be possible, and this is a little bit low-hanging fruit, though we don't know how best to structure it. My colleague Scott really likes identifying crabs, and what he loves doing is seeing that there's a group of organisms on iNaturalist that he's noticing that it seems like there's a lot of differences among them, but he has to go into the primary literature to find the detailed explanations of the differences and then translate them into sort of annotate them on the iNaturalist photos as well. And then he can point people to this little iNaturalist journal post that he's written, which is essentially like a little iNaturalist hosted blog. He can point people to this link when he is identifying crabs. And crucially, what this helps do is it means that he's not the only keeper of that knowledge now, right? He is working to make sure that not only can he identify these crabs now, he's helping other people learn how to identify those crabs. And we see these awesome examples of little sub-communities that develop on iNaturalist that are growing really growing the expertise in things like leaf miners and galls and these things that a lot of people overlook. But when there's someone or a group of people who get really excited about sharing this knowledge, very exciting things are possible. Next slide. The next bottleneck that I want to address is just broadly scale. How do we get more people from more places observing more species? Because we need more. We need more of all of these things. Next slide. the first way that iNaturalist thinks about approaching this is through design, through really keeping in mind the human experience, the human needs, and people want to interact with tools that are easy to use and beautiful. What I'm showing here is actually an example from our Seek app that makes it really easy to get initial suggestions based on the computer vision model. And this is a feature that we don't currently have in the iNaturalist mobile app, but it is something that we're working towards. And just in general, wanting to think, especially as we work on replacing some older pieces of the iNaturalist infrastructure, how can we design with people in mind so that this is something that people want to use, that they come back to again and again when they have questions about biodiversity? Next. The other thing that we have to keep in mind as iNaturalist scales is conflict, and doing what we can to prevent and mediate conflict. So the community guidelines that we have been evolving over several years are an important part of that, so that we can try to keep iNaturalist a friendly corner of the internet. When you've got people interacting, especially online, there's inevitably going to be conflict. And so we don't always get it right, but we do, we're trying our best to be prepared for that. Next. Another that was touched on earlier as well is that is language, right? So we crowdsource translations through the platform to make iNaturalist available to as many people as possible, and this is possible thanks to many volunteers who are dedicated to translation. Next. Another way that iNaturalist has been able to scale and has been through collaborations in many parts of the world. I know a couple of our collaborators are on this call through the members of the international network, and I think the most important thing to understand about the network is that these are not independent instances of the infrastructure. This is all, everyone shares the same underlying infrastructure, because isolating each network node you would lose the network effects. So everyone uses the same underlying infrastructure, and I'll show you what this looks like next. So this is what iNaturalist Greece looks like when you land there. Same look and feel as iNaturalist. Next. When you go to explore the observations, what you see, instead of being presented with things from all over the world, you see that it is filtered just to what has been observed in Greece. But all you have to do if you want to look at things from other parts of the world is just remove that Greece-specific place filter, and then you'll be able to see everything else. So this allows us to have a more localized experience while still retaining that global knowledge sharing of expertise. Next. Another crucial piece of iNaturalist is having a single underlying taxonomy, which makes iNaturalist a home for both specialists and generalists. Next. But this is also difficult, because what we find is that there are some key groups that lack global taxonomic authorities. Two great examples of that are butterflies and fungi. So we try to refer to external authorities and in our taxonomy, and so it would be incredibly beneficial to have some global consensus around butterflies, for example, so that the discussions on iNaturalist can be about identifications and less about these sort of taxonomic ambiguity questions. Next. I just wanted to close with a final reflection that occurred to me fairly recently when thinking about iNaturalist. I'm really excited about really excited to think about biodiversity citizen science in this space, not only where people need biodiversity, next, but where biodiversity needs people too. So thank you all for your time, and I'm excited for our discussions later today.
Thank you very much, Carrie, for an interesting 360-degree tour of iNaturalist. So we will have a bit of time for a few questions afterwards, but first I would like to give the floor to our second speaker today, David Roy. So David is head of a biological records center at the Center for Ecological and Hydrology for Ecology and Hydrology in the UK. And he is especially here to talk to us about the Spring project, which is about strengthening pollinator recovery through indicators and monitoring, and which is setting up a EU-wide pollinators monitoring scheme. And I hand over to you. I believe, okay, you are sharing your screen. Perfect.
Yeah, thanks very much. And thanks very much for the invitation to speak and for organising this really interesting meeting. So yeah, I'm going to talk about citizen science in biodiversity monitoring programmes, particularly talking about the EU pollinator work. But before doing that, I wanted to give some more general sort of thoughts and background. So I think it's important to sort of appreciate why we need to monitor, which is effectively looking at long-term change over a geographic area, so needs sort of dedicated effort at scale, both spatially and temporally. And it's really important for our understanding of the natural environment, and particularly how we manage resources, the scarce resources available to us, and to, of course, understand what's causing change, but really to move towards solutions, to be able to make predictions about interventions and how they're going to affect biodiversity, and also measure the outcomes of management, such as nature-based solutions, etc. So some real sort of strong policy needs and scientific needs, but also, given that these schemes often run over a long time period, in my experience over 2 or 3 decades working on monitoring through citizen science, it always amazes me at the ways that the data can be used, things that we didn't anticipate at the beginning. So climate change is a good example, where there's lots of understanding of climate change impacts through monitoring scheme data. Similarly, invasive species, etc. More recently, pesticides, etc. So having this long-term perspective allows us to sort of turn our attention and get understanding of issues as they emerge in the environment. And as well as delivering excellent data and excellent knowledge, particularly when monitoring involves citizen science, the real further benefit is the involvement of people, engaging people, informal education, well-being, etc. So I think I feel there's a sort of win-win situation through citizen science involvement in biodiversity monitoring, certainly my experience. And in terms of the pollinators, there's been some nice work by Tom Breeze and others actually demonstrating, although citizen science isn't without cost, it works best when it has coordination funding. It can more than pay for itself in terms of research that can be leveraged off that monitoring. And also in the case of pollinators, understanding the pollination service and the economic benefits of that. The economic benefits of that massively outweigh the cost of having an effective monitoring scheme. So I just wanted to say a little bit about the UK experience before I move on to the European pollinators. So in the UK, I think we benefit from having some long-term activities around monitoring that's coordinated by the Joint Nature Conservation Committee, so a governmental organisation with a nature conservation role. But the partnerships in terms of delivering the monitoring work best when they're a partnership activity involving NGOs who are particularly interested in the taxon group and can sort of stimulate interest amongst the wider public. Also research organisations that can provide technical assistance and help analyse the data and use it for research and raise the profile that way. And of course, citizen scientists are crucial stakeholders in these schemes. And the other thing that the benefit of the UK is that there is a long-term perspective on the need to invest in these activities. So they're typically the schemes are run with 5-year funding agreements between government and NGOs and research organizations. And there's been a huge amount of science delivered from these data sets, providing some of the best evidence of the impacts of climate change, for example, habitat loss, etc. And there's a video there, a YouTube video, that gives a bit more detail on the schemes. And the other point I wanted to make around, so this is a sort of collection of UK biodiversity monitoring schemes with citizen science participation from butterflies, lots of bird activity, bats, plants, and more recently pollinators. And what this shows is the cost or the financial input into these schemes. So in the blue and the green are the financial contributions of the governmental funder, JNCC in this case, but also the other funders put in their own resources, NGOs and science organizations. But what's shown in the sort of pinky orange figure is the value put on the contribution of people, volunteers giving up their time to go into the field and record, or to help quality assure the data, or in many cases also analyzing the data themselves. So a huge return on investment, so highly cost effective. So highly cost effective and involving citizens and all the benefits that gives. But the other key point about these monitoring schemes is they do deliver directly to policy. So the UK biodiversity indicator set, which is the UK's commitment to global targets and how measuring the state of biodiversity. Most, if not all, of the biodiversity measures come from citizen science monitoring schemes, as well as the research use. And this illustrates one of the more recent indicators that's been built around pollinating insects, which measures the change in occupancy, so opportunistic recording data collected over several decades for wild bees and hoverflies, almost 400 species, a sort of mean trajectory of those species. So really impactful results from this sustained investment and partnership-based working. So I just want to now move on to the European pollinator work, particularly the Spring project, strengthening pollinator recovery through indicators and monitoring. This is a project that was recommended by the members of Parliament. So it's a preparatory action coordinated by DG Environment. And we're in our final year with around 19 partners, formal partners, and led by the UFZ in Germany. And this figure here, this sort of temple figure, is the design that was proposed by a group of experts for developing an EU pollinator monitoring scheme. And the key points I'd like to emphasize across it is that there are different taxon groups that deliver pollination, bees, hoverflies, butterflies, moths, other invertebrates, for example, and each need a particular or best suited to a particular monitoring approach, and to get the best evidence of the status of pollinators in the EU, we need a combination of monitoring approaches, standardized approaches, and some of which lend themselves more to citizen science than others. Some are more suited to professional field surveyors, such as water traps or malaise traps. But it's recognized that there's a really important role of volunteers as a citizen science contribution to this, to deliver this scheme, particularly for transects and other methods such as light trapping for moths and flower visitation assessments. So I'm just going to expand a bit on the citizen science aspects of the Spring project. So the first element of Spring in terms of citizen science is building on I would say probably the alongside birds, the biggest success story in terms of biodiversity monitoring through citizen science, which is butterfly transect method, which was established in the 70s and has now been adopted. Effectively the same approach, standardized across a range of countries. We were fortunate to have a project called ABLE, which helped us develop this approach more widely in Europe. So this map shows during the ABLE project where new schemes were established through that project. And this was the situation up to 2022. So some stable BMSs, as we call them, and some new schemes starting around that time. And that's being taken forward further under the Spring project. This map really emphasizing those countries where there is not a butterfly monitoring scheme currently, and trying to complete the network across the whole of the EU, 27 countries, to have a butterfly monitoring scheme in place. And we're having good success in stimulating new schemes in Denmark, Greece, etc. So we sort of know how this works, and we're working hard with local partners to establish citizen science approaches. And this illustrates how this butterfly monitoring scheme work has expanded across the EU. The blue color is the number of transects each year. So now around 5,000 transects recorded across the wider Europe, including the EU and non-EU countries. And then yellow is the number of schemes. So there's a continued appetite for new schemes to be set up. So these are set up on a member state by member state basis, because it's important to have that connection with member state governmental organizations, but also the recording networks. So this is a huge effort undergoing across the EU. And so that was mainly based on standardized transect approach, which align transects that are repeatedly walked. We've also been developing complementary methods, particularly through using the benefits of mobile applications to collect data more efficiently by using the GPS facilities, similarly to iNaturalist, having image analysis support for identification. So this is really a crucial tool for us to widen the data collection network, but retain key information which allows us to assess trends. So the key thing is to have abundance data, so we know how numbers of butterflies are changing, and also a measure of sampling effort, so we can analyze the data more precisely. So this is all built on, I guess, the lessons learned from the butterfly monitoring work. So this is really Butterfly Conservation Europe as an umbrella organization, really central to this, connecting up the people side of connecting to experts and producing best guidance around how to develop a butterfly monitoring scheme. What we've learned is what works best is that having some paid coordination really makes a huge difference to disseminate information back to participants, to develop supporting material. Here are some examples of field guides produced in local languages, use of tools such as Facebook groups, other social media to build communities, and to deliver training in the method, but also identification of butterflies, and also providing physical materials such as nets, which are important for identifying some of the species. So that was the butterfly side of Spring, and then the wider part of Spring is to look at the landscape of citizen science for pollinators beyond butterflies, well, including butterflies, but also encompassing bees and hoverflies. So the way we've addressed this within Spring is we held a relatively small workshop with key experts in pollinators to identify the major factors that would influence the success of citizen science for pollinators, and the barriers that potentially are limiting the uptake of citizen science. And these factors were very similar to the nice report that Biodiversa has produced around the sort of key features of how citizen science needs to be supported and what barriers exist. And then we rolled this out as a wider survey across, actually globally, but mainly focused on Europe, and had a great response in terms of number of people responding to those and scoring their view on the factors affecting citizen science and the barriers. So there's quite a lot of detail that we've got collected from this survey, but I just want to focus on one part of the survey, which was when we asked people about the barriers, potential barriers, and asked them to score their view on whether they saw them as major barriers or not barriers at all. This is the ranking of those scores, with the bottom of the screen are there where people saw them as bigger barriers, and the top are where they weren't perceived to be barriers. So I think the good news is there isn't a perception that there's too many citizen science projects, or that citizens themselves don't trust scientists. And the third one down is actually, and also that there's greater appreciation from researchers and scientists that citizen science is rigorous and is valuable for biodiversity assessment for pollinators. So they were the sort of the positive outcomes from this survey. At the bottom of the screen are where it was perceived there were bigger barriers. So there was, I guess, a couple of things here is the sort of technical aspect of it's actually very challenging to monitor pollinators. You know, a very diverse group of bees and hoverflies, very difficult to identify. Even butterflies, you know, there are some really tricky species within the group. So the sort of challenge of being able to identify species is a barrier. And then the second major barrier, I think, was a lack of appreciation within the wider citizen science world that that pollinators were a subject that could be where citizen science could be an approach taken. So I think there's some clear lessons for us is that we can work with the wider citizen science communities to recommend approaches for pollinator citizen science. And one specific thing we are doing around to tackle these challenges is an approach called the flower insect time counts, where a focal flower is observed for 10 minutes and the insects visiting that flower are counted. It doesn't put a huge taxonomic identification barrier because insects can be counted at all bees or all hoverflies and simple other groups with clear guides on insect groups. So this has worked well to engage a wider community in pollinator monitoring, and it's delivering really valuable data for assessing trends and also interactions between plants and insects. This is being rolled out through the Spring project to several countries listed here and also internationally. And if there are people on the call who are interested in their country joining into this endeavor, then please do contact me. So just to summarize my talk and my views on this topic is that, well, I'm convinced, and hopefully you're through attending this are convinced that biodiversity monitoring is hugely valuable and citizen science got a huge role to play in that. Particularly for pollinators, we really do need good evidence standardized across Europe to be able to address the growing concerns of insect declines. Some alarming results coming from some studies, but very patchy in where they're coming from. We still have major gaps in our knowledge and data. Butterflies particularly have a well-developed method that's is being adopted across the EU very rapidly. We still need to work on methods for other pollinators, both citizen science methods and methods for professional survey. There's still testing being done under the Spring project. But politically, this is even more important because of the EU Pollinator Initiative and the restoration law and the targets within those to reverse the decline in pollinators. So we need the evidence that's been recognized politically. So we now need the tools to do that. And citizen science is hugely cost effective. And I think it's a really important part of the solution to insect monitoring. But I think my final point is I think citizen science isn't going to deliver what we need alone. So my view on the future is that there's going to be a hybrid approach of volunteers and professional surveys, and then we need statistical methods to bring the two together. We also have a range of sampling methods that we need to account for in our analyses, and clearly technology's got a really important role, both in data collection, but also in the analysis side. So thanks, and particularly thanks to the EU for their support for this whole area. It's made a huge difference, but also thanks for the huge number of organizations and volunteers that have been helping us to deliver this work. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, David, for this also a very interesting talk and for sharing your thoughts. We can take maybe a couple of questions before we break into the breakout groups and the break. So don't hesitate to raise a hand or drop a question in the chat. We have Toos van Noordwijk.
Yeah, hi. Many thanks to both speakers for really interesting talks, and it's really nice to see quite different citizen science projects, and that's yeah, partly a question, partly a comment. I think And the first talk was something that's very easily accessible for people who just have an interest in what they see. The second is almost a bit more, a lot of it at least is a lot of more of a research set up with specific transects and specific places to monitor to get kind of more rich data in that way, but more specific and will appeal to a different audience. But what I'm missing a little bit in both talks is who are the citizens? And I think that's something that we also always really need to keep front of mind when we talk about citizen science. There are so many different things that we all call citizen science, but are quite different. Yeah, there will be very different motivations for people to take part. So when, and I think that's where a lot of the challenges sit. It being research funding, the funding is very focused on the research outcomes and the data we get from it. But the people who participate, only a very specific audience will participate because they're interested in helping the research. A lot of people will participate for other reasons and have other motivations. So how do we bring that into the conversation, and how do we almost square that circle of getting funding from a research angle, but making sure it actually works for the citizens and gives something in return to them as well?
I can go first and then let Carrie join in. So I think, yeah, it's a really important point, I think. And I think the schemes, in my experience, that work well are where they give something back to the participants in terms of feedback on their work, and also how their data's been used. I guess from the sorts of projects I was talking about, in general, they tend to be, I guess, people with a lot of expertise in natural history and a big motivation to do something that makes a difference. So I think having the data being seen to influence policy is a big driver for a number of our participants. But also often they want to know about their particular place. So that's why the sort of standardized approaches allow them to assess, how management is happening on their local nature reserve, that sort of idea. But I think you're right. There's different communities of citizen scientists for different aims. But from my perspective, and when people have done research looking at the motivations, it seems to be people contributing because they want to make a difference to the environment.
Thank you. Thank you very much, David. Carrie, if you want to bring a short comment on this one, otherwise I see we have a few more hands raised.
You can go to a new question.
Okay. So I think we had Timo Pihelati first. Notice how I've tried to progress on the pronunciation.
Thank you. You are doing great. It's Pyhalahti, as you said. But anyway, it was very interesting to hear about the partnership model in the UK for organizing these things. And the questionnaire group on commenting the citizen science was, of course, different, but it seems that, it could be assumed that people in UK also think that there is plenty of projects available already, and it's not a scarcity of those ones. But how do you actually make these projects to interact towards with each other, or is it more like an isolated deals for some community or non-governmental organization to organize a particular branch of citizen science for collecting data or influencing the nature or whatever? Thanks.
Yeah, so one thing I didn't mention is those schemes do interact quite a lot together. So they share expertise about how to motivate and recruit participants, and there's all of them are working at the moment to look at the diversity of their participants, because there's an aim to increase the diversity of contributors because they're a narrow subset of society. So they're addressing that in a similar way so that can gain shared understanding. And there are other sort of practical aspects in terms of how to share data and under fair principles, for example. So there's good connection between them, and I think that's another value of having a coordinating organisation. As I say, it's the Joint Nature Conservation Committee in the UK that have this remit across the schemes to share best practice and standardized approaches. Yeah, I think in terms of I think it's a good model in terms of maximizing the potential of citizen science for biodiversity monitoring.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
I see a number of hands raised. I'm afraid we won't have time to take all the questions, so I'll invite in the order, I think Hilde and then Philip Hummer. And for Lars, Rainer and Graham, if you want to share your question in the chat, and I'm sure our keynote speakers would be happy to share a few thoughts in writing as well. So Hilde first, please go ahead. It's an order of raising hands.
Thank you. I just hope that my question might also help or is maybe aligning with what the others would like to know. But you both mentioned that it's indeed difficult to sustain citizen science projects like on the long term, so that there's lack of also sustainable funding, but at the same time that these citizen science initiatives projects are very cost effective. To what extent has this cost effectiveness been kind of like systematically analyzed across Europe? Do you know? And also, do you believe that if we would be in a position, I don't know how, but to some extent kind of size the commitment or the investment that is behind in a certain country and compare that maybe to some public investments? Do you think that these type of analysis could help to make the case and to maybe ensure that there's more sustainable funding? So coming up with some clear test cases from across Europe showcases that this is cost effective.
I'll just briefly chime in to say that I think David has more numbers at his fingertips, but there's clear economies of scale when it comes to supporting infrastructure. You know, it is no small task to maintain iNaturalist, and so you know, to the extent that programs can leverage existing tools and infrastructures, it's going to be much more cost effective than building bespoke platforms for each new program.
Yeah, I agree, Carrie. I was going to add from my perspective, I think so all those schemes I mentioned in the UK, they're actually all growing quite not rapidly, but they continue to grow. At not really much more cost, because as Carrie says, once you've got the infrastructure in place, you can sort of support more activity. But I think the key thing about those schemes, why they've grown, is because they've done a good job at feeding back to the participants and the wider, and so it sort of builds its own momentum by showing that it's delivering useful results. So yeah, just to add to that.
Excellent. Philippe, last question is for you, and I see there are a couple popping up in the chat. If our speakers want to have a look at these also afterwards, don't hesitate.
Okay, hi everybody. Quickly want to drop in as my role is I'm actually a citizen. So I'm not coming from a university background or research background, but on SpotRun we built the apps for also biodiversity citizen science programs. And I just wanted to highlight that it's really important to include the citizens also on a level where they are a part of presentations, and they're basically, it's a motivational piece to be seen also by the scientists and have that on a like visible level also on the exterior. So quick follow-up to Truls van Noordwijk's remark here. But I have a very short question, because in the barriers in this slide, I have not seen privacy issues or people being concerned about online privacy aspects, because in Europe we have much stronger data privacy laws, etc. So was that, for David Roy for sure, was that part of the questionnaire, or are people not so much aware of online privacy barriers basically in citizen science?
Yeah, it is an issue. I think it's quite patchy in where it occurs. So I guess some in the European sense, some countries are more sensitive to this than others. I can't remember whether it's part of our questionnaire or not, but it's certainly come up in some of the butterfly work and the pollinator work. And so the systems we use have some deal with sensitive issues, but both from sensitive species, but also people who want to protect the location of where they've been doing sampling, if it's private land, for example, if landowners are sensitive. So yeah, and I think it is a potential issue in terms of biases in some of these schemes, is that there are landscapes that citizens can't typically access very easily. So that's also an issue we're finding in the European pollinator work more generally. So yeah, I agree. Yeah, I'm surprised it doesn't come up more in terms of our questionnaires. But
Thank you. So if I recall well, I do think it's something that came up in the context of the Citizen Science Guide, at least in the barriers that were presented by Hilde from this guide. And we'll have a chance to talk about it a bit more after the break. But first, I believe I should give the floor to Cécile for some important instructions about getting sent into groups and landing in the right place. So
thanks a lot, Fred. So Julia, you can go to the next slide. So now we will have 3 groups. So 2 groups will focus on biodiversity monitoring and citizen science. And there will be the second group on the strategic involvement of citizen science in Biodiversa Plus. So if you remember well, when you registered, you indicate which group you wanted to join. So this is taken into account and this will be automatic. So maybe Julia, if you go to the next slide, you will see this message popping up on your screen and you will just have to click on the join button. And if it doesn't work, you can also send me a message in the chat. So I will now open the breakout rooms.
And just we will be back.
When do we get back? Yeah,
we get back at
we have a break now.
Yeah, so we now have a break. I think it was initially planned.
Yeah, I think we should get back at 40 past 40. The hour, wherever you are.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
Okay, we are all groups are back, if I'm correct.
Yes, you're correct.
Okay, perfect. Okay, wonderful. So we have thank you very much for your active contribution in the breakout groups. I think there's a shared feeling among all groups that this discussion could have gone on for a bit longer. Nonetheless, we'll do a short wrap up here from what was discussed in the different groups, and then we'll share also a bit what will be the next steps beyond this first discussion and this first workshop. Okay, maybe because I will be doing the restitution for the group 2, and I would like to take a bit of time to run through different points we raised. If you don't mind, Cécile, can I let you tell us who was the rapporteur for the groups 1? Sorry.
So for group 1A, we had Kari Seltzer, who is there and who will give us the main points that we discussed. Thanks a lot, Kari.
Great. So our group, I would say four themes emerged from our discussion and sticky notes. One is that we need more people involved in biodiversity science, because ultimately people is how we are going to make change. It's how we're going to get things done. But it's not just about more people, it's about the quality of the participation, both on the side of the people, like how does it feel for them? Do they want to keep doing this? And what do we need to do to keep people involved, to capture their hearts as well as their minds? And a big piece of that is tied up in communication, and this communication about the impact that they're having with the data that they collect, so that they see how their participation is connected to this bigger picture. The other pair of themes I would say is related to standardization. Standardization and I see standardization as also related to the ease of tool adoptions. And we discussed the difficulty when there's an idea for a program figuring out how to get past the barrier of what is the most appropriate tool and can we afford it. So I personally see this issue of standardization as related to this question of resources, because in order to develop and maintain the infrastructure to support a program, it takes resources. It takes both the sort of social coordination resources as well as the technical engineering expertise to maintain those things. I'll leave it there unless anyone wants to chime in on anything big that I missed.
Okay, thank you very much. I see no hands raised, so I feel this was a both succinct and complete feedback from the group discussions. I believe you had a group 1B as well.
Yeah, we had my group. We will have Natalie who will report back. So I'll give the floor to her.
Thank you. Can you share the sticky notes, Frédéric? You have this power, or how does that work?
It would be Julia, if I'm completely honest, but
okay.
we have this power.
You have this power, great. Yes, so you can, I don't know. Oops. Yes, group 1B, so it's just the one after. No? Okay. If you click on the right arrow.
Is it your page?
Yeah, this one?
I think it's page 5 or 6, but
okay. I am, or maybe 5. 3, 4, 5. Okay.
Unless I delete it. No,
okay,
no.
so it's this one. So it's less organized than the group 1A. Basically, in the first up left, we discuss more the data quality and validation. On the right part, it was more about the participation and recognition, a better education, and what are they engaging when they participate. And in the bottom left, it was more about the funding. So we split our discussion mainly about the engagement and the funding. So regarding finding ways to engage citizens and recognition, the first question we ask is what is in there for them? This is the question that needs to be better understood, but we also think that this is something that is depending on the project. So it's not something Biodiversa can really do something, because it's really dependent on the type of project to find a way to keep them in the long term. But one way that we discuss is to engage citizens from really the start in the co-design of the project. And this is a good way to keep them engaged in the long run. Also raising awareness by training, different type of training at national level. Also publishing popular articles, and so to make people more aware of citizen science and how they can contribute. Also have people to share their expertise. So more communication about what it is and how people can get engaged in this. Also an important aspect that we found was the equilibrium between the scientific need and the user experience. You need the people to enjoy it and have a nice user experience, and sometimes it's not maybe taken into account enough. And an important thing that we also highlighted for engagement and recognition is to share success stories and share data, so people have a more idea of what came out of this project. So that's the part on the right. And then on the bottom left, it was more about the funding. We really think that there is a need to integrate citizen science in funding. Until now, it's very often a tick box, but people do not really do a real project with it. So clearly it must be integrated from the beginning in the funding, and have a really dedication for this. until now, citizen science is not really well seen because it's excluded from academic record. So there is also acclimatization to better understand what is done in this project and the value of it. So we think that in future call, this must be taken into account. Yeah, and something we discussed also at the end, it was this importance of awareness that we talked a little bit before, really raise the awareness, maybe also adjust the funding rules that do not always permit to have citizen science project or some NGO included, something like that. And really make it clear what people do with the data and valorize this. I think that's the discussion. I don't know if I forgot something, if someone from the group wants to add something.
Thank you very much, Nathalie. And to be honest, it's quite intriguing to hear a number of the topics you've touched upon. I will touch upon them now as well with the feedback from group 2. So we were more discussing barriers to citizen science or challenges in citizen science, their relevance, and whether Biodiversa has a role to play in alleviating or addressing these barriers. Maybe a first comment we had from the group is indeed a number of these barriers maybe aren't applicable only to citizen science, which is important to think about. But one question we had is really trying to nail down where citizen science can have added value, because one of these aspects is that, okay, citizen science is a method amongst others and it's fit for purpose or not. And this is something that should be very clear ahead. And then a big question was a bit, why isn't it happening more? And behind this, we had a number of topics raised, and a number of these elements related to the motivation, in exploring the motivation of citizens and trying to develop motivation of citizens and contributing to citizen science campaigns. And we had different sort of angles to this. Whether it be community aspects, thinking otherwise of a business model also for citizen science, thinking also of citizens which are not only citizens, for instance, a cruise ship doing travels throughout the sea, and people, the staff from these ships who could be clear citizen science contributors with a clear opportunity. And so we had different aspects like this related more to the motivational aspect. We had a question also around the mismatch between how research projects and citizen science campaigns or schemes work, and the fact that you need some form of continuation or build up in these citizen science schemes, whereas research projects would have usually a time-bound and specific research question. And so along this, it was noted that it could be quite interesting to develop connections. For instance, when a citizen is making an observation in a given place, there's probably actually several projects he could likely contribute to through being in this place at that time. So there were different aspects like this, and clearly exploring. Also, we touched upon the funding. The funding question is key around the mobilization of actors who have citizen science models at different scales, but are maybe not always eligible to funding, including in biodiversity schemes. And of course, we're thinking here of maybe, for instance, NGOs with high expertise in citizen science, but under private status, and which can't be funded 100%. So that's a clear question for our crowd. And we talked about also, so we talked in the connection aspect, there's connecting projects and volunteers and connecting observations to several projects. There was also connecting different applications between each other. And so that's another aspect. And we had also related to this, trying to think and making the connection between reporting requirements on biodiversity, whether this be national or corporate, and the format of citizen science campaigns. We talked about the importance of this different citizen science type, from long-term monitoring schemes to more experimental setup or hybrid approaches, and that these are specific and have specific needs. And we talked also, of course, of the importance of consideration, not just the data value of citizen science, but beyond the aspects related to engagement, etc. And for the long term and the connectivity also of platforms and uptake of work, we had a couple points about learning lessons maybe from other large-scale observation initiatives like Copernicus, and the way they work with user uptake of their results. And also it was raised that we could probably have a role around contributing to demonstrating the value of citizen science in terms, of course, of economic perspective, but also for delivery of policy needs in biodiversity monitoring to help anchor citizen science in a more long-term perspective at higher decision levels as well. And I hope it's, of course, we had a number of additional elements. I couldn't cover everything, and I hope I didn't forget any major one. If I did, don't hesitate. Okay. Seems like you all have the eye on the time and the 2 minutes left in this workshop. So maybe very briefly to wrap up a bit this this session. So you see we have a bit two aspects here. From the outcomes of this workshop, first, very concretely, so we'll share the conclusions and the elements we've captured from your discussions for you to review. That's a first concrete step, and tell us if we've missed anything, if we've misinterpreted anything. And then these outcomes, they will be used in two different aspects. So the design of a European Biodiversity Monitoring Coordination Center. Concretely, we would like to bring the elements of discussion relevant in this context to the people who are developing this Biodiversity Monitoring Coordination Center, to make sure that these citizen science aspects are accounted for and integrated in there. As far as possible. And then we have elements more related to biodiversity strategy and activities design on citizen science, and some of them I've highlighted a couple key aspects where we want to use the outcomes of this discussion. One very concrete one, which will be coming in a fairly short term, is the use of the outcomes of discussion to help us guide and design the further development of the citizen science toolkit for biodiversity researchers. We've touched upon elements around motivation of citizens or different aspects like this, and also we had a number of suggestions for interesting resources. A key point was not to reinvent the wheel in our discussion also. So we had pointers to a number of interesting case studies, resources we could use for this update. And beyond this, also related also to this point of not reinventing the wheel, we would like to use these outcomes also to identify and set up synergies and win-win collaboration with the citizen science initiatives towards some of our shared objectives. Obviously, this is something we have to digest a bit more at this stage. And then I think it's interesting also to see that the discussions in this workshop also allowed us to highlight some well, maybe some aspects where we can we are in a good position to initiate the discussion, whether it be how citizen science might be evaluated or perceived in evaluation processes, whether it be the mechanics of funding citizen science and how we can promote this. And these are aspects we'll be, of course, very attentive to and looking at for developing our activities. And obviously, maybe my last message before I wrap up for real this time is we are very keen on keeping this engagement going and as far as possible showing you how we integrate the advice you give to us and how we're trying to make proposals. So we will be following up on we're keeping you informed of upcoming opportunities to follow up on these first pieces of advice, how we're taking this in and with the objective, of course, to hear also further advice from you once we get to more design and implementation stages on our side. Okay, Hilde, Anna, I don't know if you want to add a few words before we conclude this meeting.
No, just thanking everyone for all the valuable inputs. And we from the Biodiversa side are indeed also working on the next phase of Biodiversa, the next 2 years, and building a work plan. So for us, it's like very timely to have heard all these ideas, and we will already put some very concrete activities in the work plan of year 3 and year 4. And as Friedrich mentioned, then we will get back to you to keep you involved, and so you know what we are doing, and maybe again pick your brains when it comes to some of these activities. But in any case, many thanks for all these contributions. And if there would be any idea that pops in your head over the next few days, weeks, or contacts that you would like to share, so feel free to do so. We would be very happy to receive that. So thanks again. I don't know, Anna, if you want to say the final words as organizer of this.
Thank you, Frederick. Thank you, Hilde. Just to briefly add that you can still contribute to the Jamboard as for any additional points or any editing you want to make. It will be available and open until tomorrow, I think. So later today and tomorrow. So please feel free to go back, review, revise, etc., and then anything immediately. And also, as my colleagues mentioned, afterwards at a longer stage, please feel free to get back to us. We really thank you all for these lively and very helpful discussions. Thank you all for your participation, and of course we will be hopefully in touch with you, and we're looking forward to a long-term engagement.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
I also saw maybe one more question on a contact, so I will let Friedrich answer this one so that people know if they have any ideas how to maybe get in touch later on.
Yeah, indeed. So the contact points for these streams of work, I would suggest you because myself and Anna would be your spearheading people. But this being said, I'd suggest you make sure to keep Cécile and Julia in this loop. Maybe when we do the follow-up message to this workshop, we can put all of ourselves in reply to. This way you just have to reply to this message to reach out to the team working on citizen science. That's the 4 of us. Sorry, it's a European project. It has to be complicated, you know. Okay.
Wonderful.
Thank you very much, and thanks you very much for your contribution.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Have a good day.
Take care.